Take a moment and imagine stepping into an ordinary Australian street in the early 1950s. The sun is barely up. A baker's van rattles slowly past the houses. Somewhere a screen door slams. A radio hums quietly through an open window while someone prepares breakfast in the kitchen. Kids are already outside riding bikes or kicking a ball in the dirt road. It looks simple, peaceful, almost familiar. But if you looked a little closer, you'd notice something strange. The objects people used every day, the tools of ordinary life, were completely different from the things we rely on now. Hanging by the door, sitting on the kitchen bench, tucked away on verandas or in laundries were dozens of everyday items that once shaped Australian life. They were so common that nobody thought twice about them. Everyone had them. Everyone used them. And yet today, most of them have vanished so completely that younger Australians wouldn't even recognize them. These weren't famous inventions or major historical events. They were the quiet details of daily life, the objects people reached for without thinking. Things that were once as normal as breathing and are now almost forgotten. Today we're rediscovering 8 everyday things from 1950s Australia that have disappeared from modern life. Some will surprise you. Some might seem strange. And some might make you wonder how people ever lived without the conveniences we take for granted today. Let's step back in time and see what daily life really looked like. Number 1. The string bag everyone carried. One of the most ordinary objects in 1950s Australia was something almost no one owns today, the humble string bag. Every household had several of them. They were simple mesh bags made from woven cotton or string, light as air when empty but able to stretch and expand to hold an impressive amount of groceries. If you went shopping, you brought your string bag. It was as essential as your wallet. The design was brilliantly simple. When not in use, the bag could be scrunched up into a tiny bundle and slipped into a pocket or handbag. But once opened, it stretched to carry vegetables, bread, tins, fruit, and just about anything else you bought at the local shop. You'd see them everywhere. Women carrying them home from the market. Children sent to the corner store with one dangling from their wrist. Families packing them with towels and sandwiches for a trip to the beach. Unlike today, shops rarely provided bags. If you forgot yours, you carried your purchases home in your arms. Most homes kept their string bags hanging on a hook near the door, ready to grab on the way out. They were used over and over again for years, repaired if they tore, and only thrown away when they were completely worn out. The string bag represented a completely different relationship with shopping and consumption. Nothing was disposable. Packaging wasn't expected. Waste was minimal because people simply reused what they had. Then, during the 1960s and 70s, plastic bags appeared in shops everywhere. They were free, convenient, and instantly popular. Within a generation, the string bag quietly disappeared. Ironically, after decades of plastic waste, modern shoppers are once again being encouraged to bring reusable bags to the store. But the original everyday solution, the stretchy, durable string bag, has largely faded into memory. It's a small object, but it tells a big story about how daily habits have changed. Number 2. Tobacco ration cards and the corner store tick system. In the 1950s, cigarettes were everywhere in Australia. Men smoked at work, in pubs, at home, even in offices and public spaces. But something many people today don't realize is that tobacco had once been rationed. After World War II, rationing systems continued for several years, and some Australians still carried tobacco ration cards that allowed them to purchase a limited amount each week. When you bought cigarettes, the shopkeeper would stamp or mark your card. It was a leftover system from wartime shortages, a reminder that the country had recently gone through years of strict rationing. But alongside ration cards existed another system that seems almost unbelievable today, the tick. Buying something on tick meant purchasing goods on credit at your local shop. If you didn't have cash that day, the shopkeeper would simply write down what you owed in a small notebook kept behind the counter. No contracts. No credit cards. No interest rates. Just trust. At the end of the week, usually on payday, you'd come back and settle the bill. The entire system depended on community reputation. Everyone knew everyone else. If someone refused to pay their debts, word spread quickly and they'd soon find themselves unable to buy anything on credit. But for most families, the tick system worked perfectly. It allowed people to manage their weekly budgets, especially when money was tight. It also meant that local shopkeepers weren't just business owners. They were part of the community, trusted figures who knew every family in the neighborhood. Today, the small corner store itself is becoming rare, replaced by supermarkets and large chains. Credit systems are handled by banks and digital payments. The simple notebook behind the counter, filled with handwritten debts and trusted promises, has disappeared along with a more personal way of doing business. Number 3. Bread delivered to your doorstep. Most people remember the milkman of the past, but in many Australian suburbs during the 1950s there was another familiar morning visitor, the baker. Several times a week, often at dawn, a baker's van would drive slowly through the streets delivering fresh bread directly to households. Families placed orders in advance or left notes in small boxes near their front gates. The baker would stop at each house and leave loaves wrapped in paper on the doorstep. Sometimes the bread was still warm from the oven. Imagine opening your front door early in the morning and being greeted by the smell of freshly baked bread drifting through the street. That simple scent was once a normal part of suburban life. Bread didn't last long in those days. Without modern preservatives, a loaf might become stale within a day or two. So people bought fresh bread frequently and used it quickly. The baker knew his customers well. He knew how many loaves each family needed when they were away on holiday and when someone might need an extra fruit loaf for the weekend. But as supermarkets expanded and factory-produced bread became widely available, things began to change. Pre-sliced packaged bread that stayed soft for days became the new standard. Slowly, the baker's delivery route disappeared. For many Australians who grew up in that era, the memory of the bread van rumbling down the street is still deeply comforting. A small reminder of a time when food was local, fresh, and delivered by someone who knew your name. Number 4. The fly swat in every kitchen. There was one object you could find in almost every Australian kitchen during the 1950s, especially in summer. The fly swat. Not the lightweight plastic kind we see today, but a sturdy tool with a wire handle and a flat paddle made from leather or perforated metal. And it wasn't used occasionally. It was used constantly. Flies were everywhere. They buzzed through open windows, landed on tables, crawled across food, and hovered in warm kitchens. Keeping them under control required constant vigilance. The fly swat was usually kept within arm's reach, hanging on a hook, lying on the table, or resting on the kitchen bench. People used it automatically. You could be in the middle of a conversation, casually reach out, swat a fly against the wall, and continue speaking without missing a beat. Children were often recruited into the battle. Kids would compete to see who could swat the most flies during a hot afternoon. It was simply part of daily life. You'd hear the constant buzzing of insects, followed by the quick smack of a fly swat somewhere in the room. Today, houses are sealed more tightly. Windows have screens. Air conditioning keeps doors closed. Insect sprays and traps do most of the work. But in the 1950s, the fly swat was essential equipment. A quiet reminder that everyday life once required a lot more manual effort. And that was only the beginning. Because some of the most surprising everyday objects of 1950s Australia were still waiting inside the house. By the middle of the 20th century, Australian life was full of small routines that people rarely thought about. These routines shaped how people dressed, how they stored food, how they cleaned their homes, and even how they dealt with something as simple as a fly buzzing through the kitchen. Many of these things were so ordinary that no one imagined they would ever disappear. But technology, convenience, and changing lifestyles quietly replaced them one by one. Today, they feel like relics from another world. Let's continue exploring a few more everyday items that once defined daily life in 1950s Australia. Number 5. The clip-on bow tie for special occasions. If you walked into a dance hall, wedding reception, or church gathering in the 1950s, you would have noticed something about the way men dressed. They dressed properly. Even ordinary social events often required a jacket, polished shoes, and some kind of neckwear. One of the most common accessories for these occasions was the bow tie. But tying a traditional bow tie is not easy. Even today, many people struggle to get it right. In the 1950s, most men solved this problem with a clever shortcut, the clip-on bow tie. These were not the novelty clip-ons people sometimes wear today for jokes or costumes. They were proper fabric bow ties, carefully shaped and designed to clip neatly onto a shirt collar. From a distance, they looked exactly like a hand-tied bow. Many men kept one or two hanging in their wardrobe, usually a classic black one, and sometimes another with a small pattern or texture. When a formal occasion arrived, they simply clipped it on and were ready to go. This small accessory reflected something important about the culture of the time. Dressing well wasn't optional. It was expected. Men wore ties to church, to dances, to the cinema, and often even to work. Presentation mattered, and clothing was seen as a sign of respect for the people and places around you. As the decades passed and fashion became more casual, ties themselves slowly disappeared from everyday life. The clip-on bow tie went with them. Today, it's rare to see one outside of a costume party or vintage collection. Yet for a generation of Australian men, it was once a normal part of getting dressed for a night out. Number 6. The meat safe on the back veranda. Before refrigerators became common in every home, keeping food fresh required a bit of creativity. One solution that appeared in countless Australian houses was the meat safe. This was usually a wooden or metal cupboard with fine mesh sides, often placed on the back veranda or in the coolest part of the house. The mesh allowed air to circulate while preventing flies and insects from reaching the food inside. Inside the meat safe, families stored anything that needed to stay relatively cool: fresh meat from the butcher, butter, milk, leftovers, and sometimes fruit or vegetables. Of course, it wasn't true refrigeration. On hot days the contents could spoil quickly, so households developed simple tricks to help keep things cooler. One common method was draping a damp hessian sack over the outside of the meat safe. As the water slowly evaporated in the breeze, it produced a slight cooling effect that helped protect the food inside. It was simple physics at work, though most people didn't think of it that way. It was just what you did. Even with these tricks, food storage required constant attention. People shopped more frequently because food couldn't be kept for long periods. A trip to the butcher or baker might happen almost every day. The arrival of affordable electric refrigerators during the 1950s gradually changed everything. Suddenly food could be stored safely for days or even weeks. Once refrigerators became standard household appliances, the meat safe quietly disappeared. Today, if you see one at all, it's usually in a museum or antique shop, a reminder of how much effort used to go into something as simple as keeping dinner fresh. Number 7. Fly paper hanging from the ceiling. If flies were a problem in Australian kitchens, there was another weapon besides the fly swat that people relied on heavily. Fly paper. These were long sticky strips sold in small cardboard tubes. When you pulled one out, it slowly unrolled into a ribbon coated with a thick adhesive designed to trap insects. Families would hang several of these strips from ceilings, light fixtures, or doorways around the house. Within hours they would begin to catch flies. And they caught a lot of them. By the end of a day, the paper might be dotted with dozens of trapped insects, stuck in place and unable to escape. It didn't look pleasant, but it worked surprisingly well. In summer, it wasn't unusual to walk into a home or small shop and see several sticky ribbons hanging from the ceiling, gradually darkening as more flies became trapped. Every few days, they were replaced with fresh strips. Today the idea might seem a little shocking. Imagine visiting someone's home and seeing ribbons covered with dead flies hanging above the kitchen table. But in the 1950s, it was simply practical. People accepted it as part of everyday life in a country where insects were a constant presence. As houses became more sealed, window screens improved, and modern insect sprays appeared, fly paper slowly disappeared from homes. Yet for many older Australians, the sight of those sticky ribbons still instantly brings back memories of long hot summers. Number 8. The wringer washer and blue rinse day. Laundry day in the 1950s was not a quick task. It was an entire event. The centerpiece of this weekly ritual was the wringer washer, a large washing machine with an electric agitator inside and 2 heavy rubber rollers mounted on top. First, the machine was filled with hot water, often heated separately on a stove. Soap flakes were added, and clothes were placed into the tub where the agitator churned them through the soapy water. But the real work came afterward. Each piece of clothing had to be fed carefully through the wringer, the two rollers that squeezed excess water out of the fabric before it moved into a separate rinse tub. The rollers were powerful, and people had to be careful. If fingers got caught, the rollers could crush them. Many mothers developed a quick, practiced motion to guide clothes through safely. After rinsing came one more curious step. To make white clothes look brighter, many households used a small blue cube known as Reckitt's blue. When dissolved in water, it added a faint bluish tint to the final rinse. This subtle color trick made white fabrics appear cleaner and brighter to the eye. Once the washing process was finished, clothes were carried outside and hung carefully on clotheslines to dry in the sun and breeze. The entire routine could take several hours and required patience, strength, and practice. Modern automatic washing machines have turned laundry into something that can be done with the push of a button. But in the 1950s, it demanded real effort and skill. For many families, wash day was one of the biggest household tasks of the week. A final thought about the small things we forget. Looking back, it's easy to focus on the big changes in history, new technologies, major events, famous inventions. But the truth is that daily life is shaped just as much by the small things. The bags people carried, the way food was delivered, how laundry was washed, even how a buzzing fly was dealt with in the kitchen. These everyday details quietly define how people live. In just 70 years, many of these ordinary objects have disappeared completely. They were replaced by machines, plastics, supermarkets, and digital systems that made life faster and easier. In many ways, life improved. Homes became more comfortable. Work became less physically demanding. Convenience became the norm. But something else changed too. The slower routines. The daily rituals. The small skills people once used without thinking. Those things slowly faded away. And yet, when we look back at them now, they tell us something fascinating about the past. Not just how people lived, but how different the rhythm of everyday life once felt. So which of these forgotten things surprised you the most? And did your parents or grandparents ever tell stories about using any of them? Because sometimes the smallest details of history are the ones that reveal the most about who we used to be. Before we finish, if you enjoy exploring forgotten pieces of everyday history like this, take a moment to support the channel. Give the video a like, because it really helps more people discover these stories from the past.